The Torah tells us, "V'chai bahem." That the Torah is chayim; it's a way of life. And chazal v'lo yamos pem. The Torah is here to help us live and not cause harm or injury. And in fact, that's why we're all familiar with, for save the big three, for three mitzvahs. One has a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, not to commit. Some of it's a guntiat, and it says not to worship idols, not to commit illicit relations, or not to murder someone. So then the Torah tells us you have a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, better to sanctify your life and give up your life. But bar the big three, the general rule is on the 610 other mitzvahs, v'chai bahem. And even Shabbos, which is compared to Machal Shabbos Pifahesia, one who desecrates Shabbos publicly, is compared to an old day of Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara has a Havamina, but the conclusion is, we all know that one is permitted to desecrate Shabbos. Not only permitted, one has an obligation to desecrate Shabbos in order to save someone's life, whether it's your own life, getting into a car, going to a hospital, calling a doctor, whether it's saving a friend's life.
But then it's not desecration.
Right, correct. Because not only is it, but desecration, meaning if it wasn't for Shabbos, it would be considered. So therefore, in fact, it's not only desecration, it's a mitzvah. You have an obligation to, this is the way you're observing the Shabbos this week. Usually you observe the Shabbos by restraining from the Lamed Tes Malachas, but certain Shabbos, the mitzvah is to get into a car or whatever it takes to save someone. So regarding the question of saving a life and calling a doctor, there's a famous shaila in the poskim that the Beis HaLevi discusses and others is, once you have a Shabbos emergency and you're about to make the call, you have speed dial, and the case is you go have two doctors. So obviously all things have to be equal, which they never are, but in the question they will be. If all things being equal, you have two competent doctors, two competent Jewish doctors. One doctor happens to be a Shomer Shabbos, and one doctor happens to be a non-Shomer Shabbos doctor. Who gets the call? Well, obviously, if one doesn't pick up, you'll call the other one, but who gets the first call? Who do you attempt to? Assuming you could find it right away on your contacts. Sometimes I know Apple loses it somewhere, then go with the other doctor. Don't start looking around for the contact, but assuming they're right next to another, who do you call? The Shomer Shabbos doctor or the non-Shomer Shabbos? There's a famous Beis HaLevi on a pasuk we read yesterday, Vayeda Elokim, and God knew. What does that have to do with a doctor or that? Nothing. But he quotes the Medrash. What do you mean God knew? What did God know? God knows everything. You discovered America here, God knows. We know God knows. So what is the pasuk telling me? So the Medrash says, the Malachim, the angels were complaining to God. Halol Odei Avodah Zarah, v'halol Odei Avodah Zarah. That the Jews are worshipping idols and the Egyptians. So why are you punishing only the Egyptians? Why are you bringing the 10 plagues? Why are you going to bring the punishment on the Egyptians? Why not the Jews also? So God said, good kasha, but I have a better answer. The answer is because the Egyptians are doing Avodah Zarah beratzon. They're doing it willingly. They have no one. They're not enslaved. They're not being tortured. They're not being everything else. They're doing it perfectly free will. They're doing what they want to do. The Jews, because of the terrible suffering and torturing and pain, so I say they're only like an onus. They're only like someone who's doing it under duress. So it's Vayeda Elokim. Only God knows. When someone does something, only God knows. Sometimes the person himself doesn't even know. But sometimes God knows whether you're doing something baratzon or ba'ones. So that's what the Beis HaLevi says. Vayeda Elokim. God knew that the Jews were only worshipping idols because of their terrible situation, but in the normal situations they would be fine, so hence I'm not going to punish them.
So is the Medrash or the Beis HaLevi?
This is the Beis HaLevi quoting the Medrash.
Okay.
Here comes the Beis HaLevi. So based on this Medrash, the Beis HaLevi says, our Shaila, he doesn't spell it out like we are, but that's what he's basically saying. So let's say you have two doctors, two Jewish doctors, and obviously involved in the Shabbos emergency, there will be Shabbos desecration. Obviously, if it's an emergency, it won't be, but assuming it's not an emergency, so getting into a car or whatever it entails. So he says, Based on this, he says, one has to call the Shomer Shabbos doctor. He says, why? Because the other person's not an onus. He says, what's the definition of an ones? According to the Beis Halevi, a very strict standard. We're all in trouble if the Beis Halevi is right. All our excuses will get thrown away. But the definition of an onus is that the only reason I'm getting into this car, the only reason I'm driving to the hospital is because of the Shabbos emergency. In other words, the fact he drives every week, so obviously it shows it's nothing to do with the emergency. He'd get into the car all the time. So the only time you consider an onus, according to the Beis Halevi, is the only reason I'm doing this act right now is because of the emergency. Even though I might have a type of onus situation, but if I would do the act anyway, in other words, if I'm ratzon and ones, bahadi hadadi, I'm not considered an onus. In fact, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman had the same yesod. I just give a different example. Let's say someone is, every day they have their lunch special, the Jewish person, they go to McDonald's for the 99-cent special, I don't know, maybe inflation, $1.99, I don't know, whatever it is, they go for the lunch special, and they get their Big Mac, fries, whatever the works. And then one day they're walking to McDonald's, and some guy with a ski mask comes behind him, he puts a gun to his head and says, you know what, I know you're Jewish, you have to eat kosher, I want you to order this lunch special at McDonald's today. And he puts a gun to it, now he hides the gun in his jacket, and the guy says, you know, the usual, the lunch special, and he sits down and he eats the lunch special. Is he chayav? Is he liable for eating this Big Mac? Because the guy had a gun to his head saying, if you don't eat it, I'm going to kill you. So the base of the Rabbi Chanan says, when, again, the same yesod as the Beis Halevi, when you're ratzon and ones, bahadi hadadi, you're not considered an onus. Obviously, that being said, both would agree it's not the same as just going pure ratzon, but all the things, you're not labeled an onus. There is some culpability on your part. Obviously, it's not going to be the same. He doesn't spell it out, but it's obvious it's not going to be the same, unless, if he was going anywhere, but let's say a guy made, on that specific time, maybe you could get into the details, but the rule is, and the Beis Halevi quotes the Haflah. There's a Gemara in Yevamos 64. It talks about a couple who's married for 10 years. So the Gemara says, the law doesn't apply today, but we did have Gemara. Kolfin alo, you have to force him to get a divorce so he can fulfill the mitzvah of pruvu of having kids. So the Gemara limits the principle. This only applies if they're living in Eretz Yisrael. If the couple is living in Eretz Yisrael, they're not having kids, then kolfin also garsha. However, if you're living in Chutz La'aretz, the halacha doesn't apply because we could say it's the avon Chutz La'aretz. The reason why you're not having kids is because the sin of living in Chutz La'aretz, that's causing you not to be able to have kids. That's the Gemara. Comes along the Haflah and says, but we're all familiar with Tosas and Ksuvis, Rav Chaim HaKohen, who writes, Bisman Hazeh, there is no longer a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because of, during his days anyway, sakanas terachim, danger to get there, the difficulty in fulfilling the mitzvahs atuyas ba'aretz. So he says, Bisman Hazeh, there's no mitzvah. So the Haflah says, if that's the case, if today there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, so you should have to divorce your wife even if you lived in Chutz La'aretz for 10 years, because you can't say it's avon Chutz La'aretz if there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. The Haflah says, no, you got it all wrong. We all know the situation. Even if times got better many years later and we got the state of Israel and things were okay to live, you still wouldn't move to Israel. So therefore, you're not considered under. It's still avon Chutz La'aretz, even though now you can't move, but we know you wouldn't have moved anyway. So therefore, you still could get punished for not living in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore we can attribute to that, and therefore you wouldn't have to divorce your wife. So it's the same yesod that if you're ratzon and ones bahadi adadi, you're not labeled an ones, and therefore he says you have to call the Shomer Shabbos doctor. There's another medrash about Yosef. How old did Yosef live? Yosef lived to 110. He's supposed to live to 120. The medrash says. I don't know, but the medrash tells me that. So why didn't he live to? So why didn't he? Because it says the 10 times when he was having his conversation with the brothers, Yehuda and others, and they called his father Avdecha Yaakov, my servant Yaakov, and Yosef didn't make a macha, he didn't protest. So for each time he didn't protest, he lost a year of his life, but he didn't fulfill kibbutz avayim. So the Mefarish Shemayat, first of all, if you look in the Chumash, it doesn't say it 10 times. It only says it's 5 times. So where do we get 10? He said because 5 times is he had to translate. So they didn't know he knew Hebrew. So after the brother said it in Hebrew, they said it over in Egyptian. So the question is, but he couldn't protest in Hebrew, else they'll know that he's Yosef. So why should he get punished? Because since he didn't be mocha when they said it in Egyptian, and he could have, so therefore he got punished. He lost 5 years of his life for not being mocha in Hebrew. So the same thing, that since you didn't make a macha when you could have, so therefore you have onus and ratzah and bahadi adadi, is still not considered an onus, and therefore you only live to 110. That's the yisod of the Beis HaLevi. Comes along the Tzitz Eliezer, he quotes the Beis HaLevi, Rosa Waldenberg, Zatzal, and he quotes it more as it seems to be quoting it as a bitmi, I wonder, like, wow, the Beis HaLevi says a tremendous chiddush. Like, do we actually go like this Beis HaLevi? And at the end of the day, he concludes with the same result as the Beis HaLevi, but for a totally different reason. He doesn't agree with the yisod of the Beis HaLevi, but he concludes with the yisod. He says he's called the Shomer Shabbos doctor. Why? He says because, let's say you get there, we know Yiddish Shemama, it's a little virus, but they think it's an emergency. They call the doctor gets there, it's not a big deal. So obviously for the emergency part, you do whatever you have to. But let's say it's not an emergency, so what are you allowed to write down? When should you write the prescription? Could you turn on lights? Could you do all these other things? Up until you think it's an emergency, everything's fine. But once the doctor finds out it's not, so the one who knows the halakha is going to know what to do. The one who doesn't know isn't going to know what to do. So he says from a pragmatic level, that Tzitz Eliezer says one should call the Shomer Shabbos doctors will know in times when it's not an emergency what to do. And would
you also consider this in Zakhin says that you can't accompany an Amaretz on a journey because it's he doesn't pass out in his own life, so he's not going to also care about your life either.
Yeah, well, we have that you showed in general in halacha. If a person isn't careful in a certain part of halacha, then they can't be trusted. Let's say someone doesn't keep kosher themselves, can't be the mashkiach. In other words, if you're a mummer, you could be a mummer l'davarecha. Like if you don't keep taras, so we have that halacha in general. So that's more of a general cloud. You know how you apply it. But let me just finish off here. So when I first heard the shaila, I thought the opposite. Not like the Beis HaLevi. Maybe I still do things that way. Not like the Beis HaLevi. Not like the Tzitz Eliezer. And I found out I was in good company. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein also have the same svara I had. They say you go with the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor. What's the svara of going with the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor? So my svara was usually there were 25 hours in a Shabbos, depending where. Some places there's 26, some are 24 and a half, but you got 24 hours of Shabbos, let's say. So the person for the non-Shomer Shabbos doctor, they'll be doing what they do. They'll be going to the movies, cleaning their car, whatever they do on a Shabbos. But the Shomer Shabbos doctor is going to be in shul, davening, eating the chulin, sleeping, doing mitzvahs all day. So at least for that 6-hour emergency, instead of that person being machal Shabbos for 6 hours, got to be involved in the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. And therefore that's a Rav Moshe thought and Rav Yaakov that's better to call the non. And this on a practical level, if the if the person's in the middle of the Shabbos, why call that person if he's involved in the mitzvah? So therefore, Rav Shlomo Zalman went with the other school of thought. But the question actually Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Moshe discussed was a different child also. Let's say you're let's say you're medical school students, and I guess they set up systems. Is the Shomer Shabbos doctor allowed to switch with the non-Shomer to give him the Shabbos? And let's say you get set up, you're working on Shabbos. They say if you want to switch with anyone, you can. Because the Shomer, of course you could switch with a non-Jew, but can you switch with another Jew who doesn't keep Shabbos? So Rav Shlomo Zalman says no, it's Lifnei Iver. And Rav Moshe says no, since whatever the svara is, whether he's going to be doing it anyway. So it's Rishitasan, and that's what Rav Moshe says here also, that one is permitted to, in fact, he says it's preferable to call the non-Shomer Shabbos. So either way, so as I said, all things being equal, usually you don't have that shaila. You usually have one doctor. Don't start thinking about which one to call, because the Yerushalmi says that whoever, that on one hand, that's the first halacha the rabbi has to teach the community is that you have to be machal Shabbos to save lives, because it says, as Yerushalmi writes, that one who hesitates when he has to save a life, it's ki'ilu shofech damim. So therefore, don't worry about which. Just get on the phone and call someone. And secondly, the one who is asked, hareza maguna. So what do you mean? Somebody asks me, I'm maguna. Why is it my fault? It's my fault if I haven't taught you that. If you have to ask the question, there's a problem, because the time you ask me the question could be too late. So you have to know beforehand that any type of Shabbos emergency, ask for forgiveness. Don't ask for permission. Just make sure, if you're not sure, even a suffix pikuach nefesh, take care of the matter, because you can always do tshuva. You can't go ahead and bring someone back. So if you have any chashash of a Shabbos emergency, make sure you take care of the needs of the chola first, and then you know, obviously if it's not an emergency, find out what, then you can ask a shayla. But emergency, it's too late. Ask before the emergency. You can't wait till the emergency happens. The Yerushalmi tells us, and it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch as well, that it is a mitzvah to violate Shabbos for an emergency. Obviously, it's not a violation of Shabbos. It's like eating on Yom Kippur. Usually, eating on Yom Kippur is a biblical prohibition. But when someone's a chola sheyesh bo sakana, when someone is in danger by not eating, so one has a mitzvah to eat. How much one eats, and in the manner they eat, that's a discussion among the poskim, whether one can eat in a normal fashion, or one has to eat pachas mikshir, or one has to eat less than the prescribed amount in a certain amount of time, but that we'll come back to. But either way, there's a concept that when it's pikuach nefesh, docha kol Torah kua. The pikuach nefesh supersedes all mitzvahs in the Torah, save the big three of avodah zarah, gilui arayis, and shvichas damim. And in fact, there's a famous Maisa that Rav Soloveitchik used to say over, and I've heard from Rav Schachter, others, that when he was younger, he remembers that when he got sick, his father, he remembered he was around with his father and his grandfather. His father of Moshe Soloveitchik, his grandfather of Chaim, and the doctor came, and Rav Chaim said to the doctor, "Do you need the light? Do you need light?" So the doctor said, "It can't hurt." So Rav Chaim told Rav Moshe, "Well, okay, so turn on the light." And Rav Moshe hesitated, and Rav Chaim screamed at him and called him an apikoros. How could you hesitate? I told you it's pikuach nefesh. And of course, that's the famous saying they say over in Rav Chaim, if briskas are so machmir, how come he was makel by Shabbos? So his famous answer is, I wasn't makel, I wasn't lenient regarding Hilchot Shabbos, I was machmir behilchos pikuach nefesh. I'm machmir when it comes to saving lives. So therefore, one has to go out of the way, and then someone has an obligation when someone is sick to violate the Shabbos. In fact, the Gemara tells us in Yuma, Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph, that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos, and then the Gemara later on Daf Pei Hey goes into different sources of how do we know this is true. Minayin with pikuach nefesh docha Shabbos. A couple of rabbis were traveling on the road, and they wanted to know, where do we know that one is permitted to desecrate the Shabbos to save someone's life? Everybody was in agreement that you have to. The question is, what is the source of it? So, one opinion the Gemara gives is from Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah writes that if Mila is docha Shabbos, we know Vayom Hashmini Imo Besara Lasso, that when the date is on Shabbos, or Yom Kippur, Yontiv, any day of the year, if it's a Mila Bizmana, it's Docha Shabbos, it supersedes the Shabbos. So if Mila, which is only only affects one organ of the body, and yet we say it's Docha Shabbos, how much more so if the vital needs of the whole body are needed, you have to keep the person alive, so it surely overrides the Shabbos. And the Gemara goes through the different details about what type of milas are Docha Shabbos, what aren't. But the bottom line is that the source of Eliezer ben Azariah is from Mila, that if when we're concerned with one organ when Machal Shabbos, even though that's not necessarily a health issue, I mean Mila might be healthy as well, but knowing the reason why, if you waited to day 9, from a physical point of view, it's not like the child's in danger, but nevertheless, that's the Eliezer ben Azariah's drasha that we learn now from Mila. Rav Shimon ben Menasya Omer, he quotes the famous principle we learn out from the pasuk. We say Friday night in davening, Shabbos morning. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael sa Shabbos l'asesa Shabbos l'dorosam baris olam. The famous pasuk that he learns out, better to machal Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmor Shabbos harbe. Better to violate one Shabbos so you could keep many more. If someone's sick and they're going to die, or if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to die. Better to violate this Shabbos so you should keep many more. Kind of like the Rambam writes in Hilchos Mamre when he talks about when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, so we say no shofar today. Why not no shofar? It's a mitzvah in our Torah. We're going to be lacking. He says, yeah, well, you will be lacking, but he compares it, where do the Chachamim get the power from? The Chachamim get the power that, imagine someone walking by and they see someone butchering someone, but they get a closer look, they see it's the doctor, and the person is gangrene, and basically you're cutting off the leg in order to save the life. So to certain times we have to be lacking in mitzvahs. In the big picture, we're going to gain overall. That the fact he is missing a leg, but he has his life. You might be missing shofar this year, but the surah of Shabbos and everything else is intact. So they point out that even though that's that's a din drabanan, we're making a fence around it based on Motzasser. Over here, the Gemara has a drasha from the pasuk. It is a din daraisa. Obviously, the one is permitted, not only permitted, one has an obligation to be mechal Shabbos, or to save the individual. And the third pasuk from Shmuel is in Vayikra Yud Ches Hey V'chai Bahem Lo Yamus Bahem. The Torah was given as a way of life and not a way of death, and therefore one is obligated to save one's life. So the Gemara had 3 different drushes. One is based on what we learn out from Mila, that it's like Mila is Docha Shabbos, so too when your whole body's in sakana. The second drasha from Rosh Shimon ben Menaseh, that Chalalav Shabbos Achas Kedei Lishmor Shabbos is Harbe. And the third drasha of Shmuel, V'chai Behem Lo Yamush Behem. And in fact, that's the kasha that sits Eliezer. Many other Mefarshim ask, is why does the Gemara need 3 different psukim, or 3 different sources to learn this out? Why wouldn't one? So number one, we'll see the differences the Mefarshim point out based on what the source is. Some situations, according to the source, you might be able to violate Shabbos. Everyone agrees in a regular case you have to, but let's say in the case of someone who's not going to keep mitzvahs, what about if it's only a fetus, if it's not an Adam? So based on the different psukim, we learn out things. But the Sitz Eliezer points out, in a more general sense, that since the Gemara in many places compares one who's Machal Shabbos Ki'ilu Oved Avodah Zarah, so I might be hesitant. I'm not going to be Machal Shabbos. Just like I can't save my life to worship idols, I'm not going to save my life to keep Shabbos. Nevertheless, no. The Gemara emphasizes that one has a chiyuv to violate Shabbos in order to preserve human life, in order to save, go to the hospital and save someone. And in fact, that's as I pointed out, it's the famous Yerushalmi that's brought down that one of the first halachas one has to learn, teach the community, is that for pikuach nefesh, safek pikuach nefesh, one has to be machal Shabbos. In fact, Rav Shechta always says over that someone came to him and said, I wasn't sure, I ended up going to the hospital on Shabbos, and I want to know what type of tshuva I need. So, obviously the details make a big difference, what the details were, but there's a general thing. He said, well, tell me who your rabbi is. I got to call him and tell him he's the one who has to do tshuva. He's the one who should have taught the community. So obviously, you can't, so maybe he didn't get to it. You're not getting. It's the first thing you have to teach is that in the case of pikuach nefesh and even safek pikuach nefesh, because one who asked the question, ki'ilu shofech damim. If you have to ask the question, that could be the difference between life and death. And you already know that and the Rishonim says the converse. He says, and whoever the rabbi who is asked, harei zeh maguna. It's not a good thing to be asked. Why is it the rabbi's fault? Because he didn't teach. In fact, I think there's a ma'aser Rav Shechta says over as well with Rabbi Schwab, and he was there, and someone came over to him and said, my daughter is very sick, and I bring her to the hospital. He says, hurry up, go. I don't want to be, he was interested in saving the child's life, but he said, I don't want to be a maguna. I don't want to be in violation of the Yerushalmi. So he said, don't ask questions, just go. So obviously, again, you have to know who you're talking to. Obviously, one could pervert any type of thing. I have a little headache, so maybe I should go to the hospital, or etc. So obviously, it has to be something real. But obviously, and similarly, let's say you call up and a bunch of people come, so there's nothing to feel bad about it. They're all coming to be, I think the Gemara talks about by Kiddush HaChodesh, but as well by here, if you have 3 doctors show up, so what? When they came, they were coming for pikuach nefesh, so they were involved in the mitzvah. So they don't have to worry. And as well, the Shulchan Aruch points out, in addition to the physical dangers, and of course psychological as well, but the Shulchan Aruch brings down this Teshuvas HaRashba on it, that you also have to obligated to Machal Shabbos to save someone from a spiritual issue. What do you mean a spiritual issue? Meaning someone, he's getting kidnapped, they're converting, another religion's coming to forcibly convert this individual. And it happens on Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch says, obviously you're obligated to go and violate Shabbos to save someone from being spiritually taken. The Mishnah Berurah gets into the question, what happens if one goes on his own and he's not forced? So then you let him machal Shabbos for it. So Mishnah Berurah claims that if it's voluntary, then you can't violate biblical laws. It's a discussion if you can violate rabbinical laws. He's lenient. Again, that gets into what's considered voluntary today. We know we have the concept of a tinok shenishpa. Many fall under the category of a child that doesn't know any better. So whether someone is a tinok shenishpa, that will play a role as well in terms of going ahead and trying to save someone. In a similar vein, they say over, I think Rav Sternbuch brings down from Rav Chaim Soloveitchik that he himself would violate Shabbos when during his days, if a Jewish child was drafted to the army or taken away, that could be it. He'd not come back, he won't go back from. That's what would happen the child would usually abandon and leave Judaism. So therefore, Rav Chaim himself, they say, would violate Shabbos himself in order to try to save this child before it's too late. So we see whether it's physical matters, and of course we take psychological matters just as seriously as physical. It's a harder measuring stick, but If it's psychological pikuach nefesh, we also take that into account. And the Shulchan Aruch as well takes into account a spiritual issue, that if it's a spiritual pikuach nefesh, that by doing pikuach nefesh, by being drafted to the army like Rav Chaim thought during his time, or by missionaries taking some, whatever the case may be, one has to realize the principle of better to machal Shabbos achas kadesh yishmo Shabbos habe, or based on the principle of the Chai Bahem, and obviously we'll get into more details exactly in the particulars. What can you do? When can you do machal Shabbos? Blank, just a blank check. You can do whatever you want. Other times, when do we minimize the Yisurim to do only things that are necessary? The rice is Rabbanan, so we'll have to go into more details next time. Continuing our discussions on emergencies, so we'll discuss today a little bit about the question of, can one put oneself in a situation where they know it might lead to Chilul Shabbos? It might lead to the desecration of Shabbos. In other words, there's a famous machlokes, the Ramban and the Baal Amor, regarding Mila. The Gemara has different cases of Mila, but the Gemara, the case the Rishonim discuss is the water spilling. Back in the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara, before we had septics, antiseptics, we have medication. The Mishnah says, "Marchitin es hakatan ben lofnei amila ben la'achar amila." The halacha was that one washes the katan with hot water before and after the circumcision, and clearly it was a case of a health issue. And if you didn't, it would be a sakana. And as the Beis Yosef writes in the 1500s, that during his time, and in fact you're allowed to machal Shabbos for it if you had to, but the Beis Yosef already writes, Bizman Hazeh, that we see that we don't need that anymore. We have better ways of keeping the child healthy. So one is not permitted to be machal Shabbos anymore to heat up the hot water. So we see that if it's something that's just for pure health reasons, everyone seems to agree that the halacha no longer applies, which gets into, which I'm not getting into now, but that's the whole shaila of the metzitza shaila, of metzitza b'peh. If metzitza b'peh, metzitza at all, it's mashaf and the Gemara, metzitza is a health issue, that if the mohel doesn't do the metzitza, you fire the mohel. Apparently because he's putting the child in danger. That's the question today. We all assume you do a mitzitza today. That's not doing a mitzitza is not really on the table. Well, halacha, l'maisa. But how you do a mitzitza? So that ties into that shiloh. If it's just a pure health issue, so just like marchitin and sakata no longer applies, maybe one could argue you no longer have to do mitzitza b'peh anymore. Or you say no, mitzitza b'peh wasn't just a health issue. There are other more inherent issues with the mitzitza, but that's a separate chair. But getting back here, we see the water was clearly a health issue. So machita zakatam alofnei amila ben la'achar amila. So the question is, so clearly if a person did the mila and then the water spilled, so of course the child's in danger, so you have to get the water heated up. Whether you get a non-Jew to do it, you do it, depending on how quick you need the water, if the non-Jew's around. But bottom line is, you give me machal Shabbos, clearly it's a case of pikuach nefesh. The child's life is in danger to little katan, katana, or katan since it's a circumcision, and therefore you go ahead and machal Shabbos. That's a given. That's not a shaila. If the water spilled after you did the milah, the shaila is what happens if the kids are running around and they knock over the water the water before you do the Milah. But it says Yom HaShmini Yimo B'Sar Allah, so we know the Milah itself is Docha Shabbos, but we pass can Makshiri Milah Eino Docha Shabbos. That's the opinion in the Gemara Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer pass can Makshiri Milah is Docha Shabbos. We pass can no. So therefore, the Milah is Docha Shabbos, but not the accessories. So therefore, what do we do? So the Ramban writes, Eilcha mitzvah elo l'shaitza. The Ramban points out that a mitzvah is only for that time. In other words, we don't make cheshbonos, what's going to happen afterwards. All I know is the Ramban writes, the Torah tells you, V'yom hashmini yimo basar alaso. I don't have to be a chacham, I don't have to make cheshbonos. And therefore, I do the milah and then let the chips fall where they may. If they have to go ahead and heat up hot water, okay, so the child's in danger. And the Balamor says, no, you have to be roa es hanolad, not as roa es hanolad 3 months from now, but in the next couple of seconds you do, next couple of minutes. He says, you know that if you're going to heat up the hot water, if you do the milah, you're going to have to heat up more hot water. Therefore, he says, you wait until Sunday to do the circumcision. You push, even though normally you do Yom HaShmini, but since you know it's going to be Gorei Mechilul Shabbos, of course it will be Beheter once you do it, but you can't put yourself in a situation where it's going to lead to Chilul Shabbos. So therefore, it's a Machokas Ramban Balamor. The Machaber, the Shulchan Aruch seems to pass like the Balamor. You'd wait until Sunday, even though, as I pointed out, we don't really have this today because we don't heat hot water anymore. We have other medicinal means. But we see that the Shulchan Aruch passes like the Balamor, that you push it off. The Shaila is, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos about not going on a trip, not going on a boat trip 3 days before Shabbos. Either the concern is it's going to end up, you're going to have to fix the fit, the boat, the raft, whatever it might be, and then we go in Chol Shabbos, but to oneg, different reasons given in the Rishonim. The Gemara says, so 3 days before you can't go, but however, with Var Mitzvah, if you're going for the mitzvah purposes, i.e., Parnasa, you have to make a living, that's also a mitzvah. So therefore, then you're allowed to even afil Erev Shabbos. You can even go Erev Shabbos. So we see, for recreational purposes, you can't put yourself in a situation where on Shabbos, where it might be going Chilul Shabbos. But for mitzvah purposes, you can. So they ask on the Balamor, last I checked, Milah is a mitzvah. Milah is a mitzvah purpose. So how come you could go on a boat ride Erev Shabbos, even though you know it might lead to Chilul Shabbos because it's a Dvar Mitzvah, but Milah you can't. So some want to make a distinction between the two cases, Suffolk versus Vadai. In other words, in the case of the boat case, it's a Suffolk. You don't know. I don't know what the odds were then, but you don't know that you're going to have to fix the boat. You may not. So you're allowed to put yourself in a case where it's only a Suffolk. And you're doing a mitzvah, and the consequence is only a Suffolk, Chilul Shabbos, and then you don't have to worry about it. But in the case of the Milah, it's a Vada. You know, right after you do the Milah, the child's going to be in Sakana, so therefore you have to do it right away. Hence, that's why when it comes to Milah, no, because it's definitely going to happen. But by the case of the boat itself, that's why it's similar we find, not the same, but by Milah and Shabbos, that we know that Milah we do, Afilu b'Shabbos. In contrast to other mitzvahs, we're all familiar with the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and other places of Gzeira D'Rava, that even though the Torah says to blow shofar on Shabbos, it doesn't actually, it says to blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and also Sheikh Lulav on Sukkot. So we all know that when it falls out on Shabbos, Gzeira D'Rava, we don't make a Gzeira anymore. I mean, we do make a Gzeira, we don't blow shofar. We want to protect, we're afraid you're going to be a Machal Shabbos. So why don't we make the same Gzeira regarding bris milah. So there are many answers to that shaila, but one answer is because by the other days it's a sveika diyoma. We don't know exactly what day it is, so therefore for a suffix, we're not going to let you be mechal yontiv or Shabbos. But by milah, it doesn't make a difference the days on the calendar. You count 8 days, so Badai versus Suffix. Either way, that's what some point out here, the Balamor, when it comes to a Badai Chilul Shabbos, so then you have to push it off. But if you're involved in a mitzvah, it's only a Suffix, you don't have to. Another answer the Achronim give is, when are you putting yourself in that situation? The Balamor is talking on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, when the Chiyah of the Isser of Shabbos applies right now, when you're doing it, then you can't put yourself in a situation when right now I can't do it. But in the case of the boat ride, it's Friday. Friday, everything's mutter on Friday. So therefore, on Friday, it's not yet Shabbos yet. So if it's happening on Shabbos, so then that's the Balamor. You have to wait until Sunday. But if it's happening during the week, so I don't have to worry during the week about what's going to happen on Shabbos. Well, so based on this runs into the shaila of a doctor who's a resident, and we know you have a Shomer Shabbos residency and a non-Shomer Shabbos residency. And that's a whole machlokes, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Moshe Feinstein, among others, whether a Shomer Shabbos resident could switch shifts with a non-Shomer Shabbos resident, because he's going to be Machal Shabbos anyway, so you over Lifnei Ivir or not. And similar shaila in the Israeli army, where people, let's say, work on the Temple Mount, so whether Shomer Mitzvahs people want to, not that obviously if it's Sakana you're allowed to anyway, but in cases where, let's say, strictly speaking, things that shouldn't be done, so you let it switch with someone who is a non-observant Jew. So that's a whole discussion. Rav Shlomo Zalman says no regarding the resident, and Rav Moshe says yes. So one of the issues is, are you going to put yourself in a situation where you know it's going to lead to Chilul Shabbos? So could I sign up? I'm not thinking you become a doctor, but if you know there's going to be a Shomer Shabbos, you have to do residency on Shabbos. So that's the issue. One leniency in the equation. There's a lot more that goes into it, but since if you're making that decision based on some achron, if you're making that decision during the week, on Tuesday or Wednesday when I'm allowed to, I don't have to keep Shabbos. Shabbos isn't chayav. So if it ends up that it's on Shabbos, so that depends probably more on the two issues. Like if you say it's Vadeh versus Suffix, so according to the first, if it's Vadeh going to happen, so that's according to answer number one, that's more of a problem, because as in the Balamor says not even to do the bris on Shabbos, wait until Sunday. So if it's going to be, so in that sense of a Vadeh, that's more of a reason that it's a problem. If you go with the second answer, that it's you're putting yourself in a situation during the week, then there's more room, at least from that aspect, to be lenient. So these are some of the issues regarding the famous Machogas Ramban Balamor, regarding the issue of can one put oneself in a situation where it might be Gorim Chilul Shabbos. We have it by other places as well, not just the Gorim Chilul Shabbos, but Machogas Minchas Chinuch Noda Yehuda regarding Karban Pesach being Derech Rechoka. The whole discussion, the halacha is that if you Derech Rechoka, so you putter, and you can do, you bring a Karban on Pesach Sheni. Shilas, can one put oneself in a situation where you make yourself Derech Rechoka? So we have no one says it's a good thing to do, but the shaila is if you do it, can one? So some say, it's aser, and others say it's okay. I mean, if you do it, that's the whole discussion. Exactly, the two. I think the Minchas Chinuch and the Noda Yehuda, and that's what we find in the negative side And similarly, we find on the positive side, we find that's the mitzvah of sittah. So you put it on a four-corner garment. So we put ourselves in a situation where we could do more mitzvahs. And that was the whole Gemara in Sota with Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe was mitzvah to go to Eretz Yisrael so he could fulfill more mitzvahs. So again, so we see it's both sides of the coin. We have to avoid a situation. We have to be ro'as hanoah to a certain extent, and not just in Chil Shabbos and lives. That we have to be ro'as hanoah and see not to try to put ourselves in a situation down the line where it might lead to some compromising situations. And similarly, we have to emulate Moshe Rabbeinu, not only not to avoid putting ourselves in Chil Shabbos or other situations, but put ourselves in a situation where we could do as many mitzvahs as possible. The Gemara in Shabbos, and Daf Yutes Amud Aleph, 19a, discusses taking a boat ride, taking a trip on a boat trip that will go through Shabbos. You go on a trip and you're going to be traveling part of the trip. You'll be traveling on a boat over Shabbos. The Gemara says over there that you cannot go on a boat trip within 3 days of Shabbos. That's the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Yutes. However, the Gemara seems to limit this prohibition to a recreational trip, but not for but for the sake of a mitzvah. However, one could even go on the last 3 days. In fact, because we know from the Rishonim, the halacha is that you could make Havdalah until Tuesday night. So we know the week is split up into the first 3 days and the last 3 days. So therefore, it's a totally different halacha, but with similar distinction. We start preparing for Shabbos Tuesday night / Wednesday morning. We say the special Yom, mentioning Shabbos at the end, in order to tell us that now we're on the second half of the week. So the Gemara limits the klal. You can't travel 3 days for recreation, but for a dvar mitzvah you can. And the Shulchan Aruch seems to paskin this way, and as well as the Achronim point out, Rav Moshe, the Stipler, others, that we're dealing with a rabbinical prohibition here. It's not a biblical prohibition. You can't get onto a boat ride 3 days before, but midrabanan, they made a prohibition. What is the reason for the prohibition? So there seems to be a machlokas, a dispute between the Rif and the Baal Hamor. The Rif on the Daf Rif on Daf Zayin Amud Beis, he says that usually it takes 3 days for most people. Obviously, people who travel by boat a lot, maybe they don't need an adjustment anymore, or people who have seasick never adjust. But the average person needs about 3 days to adjust to sea travel. And therefore, the problem is if you go within 3 days before Shabbos, that means you're not going to be able to enjoy your Shabbos. It's kind of like a bittul oneg Shabbos. So in order to ensure that you enjoy your Shabbos, therefore, the rabbis had in mind, they wanted to ensure that you're at full strength for Shabbos, so they said, don't go on a boat ride, do a boat trip, because it'll end up to bittul oneg Shabbos. The Baal Hamor takes a different approach. Also on Zayin Amud Aleph in the Daf Arif, he says, as like you mentioned before, that 3 days before Shabbos, that's considered prior to Shabbos. Like we said, the week is split into two. On Wednesday we start preparing for Shabbos. So therefore he says, one who goes on a trip on Wednesday, so it's almost like he's mischaven, it's like he had kavanah to enter a situation that he's going to have to be Machal Shabbos on. Of course, Machal Shabbos will be mutter, it's pikuach nefesh, but in a situation where ordinarily he would not be permitted to do it. So it's a machlokas, the Baal Hamor and the Rif, in terms of What is the reason for the 3 days? Is a Bito Onik Yantiv, Bito Onik Shabbos, or we're afraid it's Gagim Ischaven to be Machalo Shabbos. So that's the Machokas here. And then within the Gemara says, which bar mitzvah you could go for recreational purposes, you can't go. So Rabbeinu Tam, quoted by the Torah in Arachayim, points out he's very lenient, and if this would affect most people now, it's more plain-fied, but he says for business purposes, or perhaps visiting a family member, a friend, Bikar Cholem, some other type of purpose, he's very lenient on the definition of Dvar Mitzvah. However, whatever isn't a Dvar Mitzvah, whatever that means exactly, it's for pure recreation, it's a Davar Rishah, so then Rabbi Tam agrees that one should not go, and that seems to go with the lenient view that we'd have a very liberal definition of what Dvar Mitzvah is, and therefore you're permitted to go on those trips. So today where does this Shiloh come up? So not related to boat trips, but to the mitzvah of bris milah. We all know the Torah tells us, "V'yom hashmini yimol b'sar alaso." On the 8th day you do a circumcision. U'v'yom afilu b'Shabbos. However, the lach is only a milah b'zmana is done on Shabbos. A milah shelo b'zmana is not done on Shabbos. We pass it's not done at night either. It has to be done. It has to be done at a later time. So the shaila is, let's say a person has a bris pushed off. So the Nadi Yehuda quotes a practice he was against. I guess it better be close to Pesach, but they used to wait and do the bris on Erev Pesach so the Bechor, so the firstborns could eat. He was against that practice. He says Amila Shalom Izmana has to be done generally as soon as possible. So let's say a child who, based on health reasons, couldn't do the bris on day 8. So ordinarily you do it the first day after day 9, day 10. Or let's say someone's converting to Judaism. So what happens if someone wants to convert and they want to do the Milah on Thursday or Friday? Or a person wants to do a bris. Day 9 is Thursday or Friday. So could you do a bris, a Milah Shalom Bizmana on Thursday or Friday, or not? So the Tashbeish says it's Asur. He says that since we know that the Machokas among the Achronim, whether it's Dafka the 3rd day, the Yom Shlishi Lo Milah, so we learn out from Avram Avinu. As Rashi tells us in the beginning of Vayera, we learn on Parshas Vayishlach by Yaakov's children. When they killed Anshe Shechem, they waited to the 3rd day. So some say it's Dafka the 3rd day. I think the Taz, others of them say no, anything within the 3rd day. So the Tashbei says that the one who has to push off a bris to Thursday and Friday, at least he says it on Thursday. It's a discussion whether it applies to Friday or not. You can't do a bris on Thursday or Friday, a Milah Shalom Bizmana or a conversion. The Shach disagrees with the Tashbetz, and he says, what do you mean? Milah is a mitzvah. And as the Rabbeinu Tam says, the Gemara says, with Var mitzvah, it's okay. So since it's a mitzvah, what is permitted to perform, even if later on it will require a Chilul Shabbos later on. Just like we say, by the boat ride, you could go on a boat ride 3 days before, even if it might lead to Chilul Shabbos. So too, the Shach says it's not an issue. If you're doing a mitzvah, you could do it Thursday or Friday. And that's how the Mishnah Berurah seems to paskin as well, that we do a Milah Shalom Bizmana on Thursday and Friday. The Chacham Tzvi, he also agrees with the Shach, but his son, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was an independent thinker, he wants to make a distinction between what type of circumcision? Are we talking about a Jew who pushed off his circumcision because of the health of the child? Or we're talking about a non-Jew who wants to convert to Judaism. So Rabbi Yaakov Emner wants to say that a Jew who's chayiv and doing bris milah, as no Yehuda points out, so he can't wait, he has to do on Thursday or Friday. But a non-Jew, there's no mitzvah for him to convert, there's no mitzvah to do the milah, so he should wait until Thursday or Friday. So regarding a bris that's pushed off, so as the Magen Avraham and others point out today, that we don't really lead to Chilul Shabbos today on circumcision. So the practice among Ashkenaz is we usually do Thursday and Friday, and perhaps I think even for a Geiris that we do Thursday and Friday, we're not concerned anymore that it's going to be an issue. However, someone told me the minhag among the Sfardim, Rabbi Yosef, they quoted to me saying that you should not do bris on Thursday or Friday. Obviously, a milah bizmana you do, but milah shalom bizmana you don't do. So that's the shaila by bris. So we have the bull ride shaila, we have the bris shaila, and one other issue is the poskim raises. What about elective surgery on Thursday or Friday? Obviously, if you need a surgery, health issue, obviously there's nothing to talk about. What about elective surgery? So Rav Moshe and the Lubavitcher Rabbi both say that one should avoid an elective surgery with 3 days before Shabbos, because they say either because the Riv's reason applies because it's going to lead to a bittul oneg Shabbos, and perhaps as well you have to go after the surgery, you have to go back, or you never left the hospital. That also might be an issue. So based on the reason the Baal Mor and the Riv, they say one should not do elective surgery. And in the Shmir Shabbos Kehilchasa, he writes one should try to have surgery, if possible, in the beginning of the week. However, as Rav Shlomo Zalman points out, and it seems logical as well, even without Rav Shlomo Zalman, he certainly adds weight to it, that if you have a more qualified surgeon to do it on the latter half of the week, go with the qualified surgeon. However, the Sitz Eliezer, number one, adopts the question of that's a separate question in terms of elective surgery being mutter or usur, cosmetic surgery. So I think the Sitz Eliezer's sheet is obviously every elective surgery is a mitzvah, because if it was something that was usur, you wouldn't be able to do it at all. But that being said, so if it's a dvar mitzvah, obviously, then we say it depends what an elective surgery is. If elective surgery is a mitzvah, so then we can do it even on the latter part of the week. I think on a practical level, the Tzitz Eliezer, who was in charge of the rabbinic issues at Shari Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim, they always allowed surgeries on Thursday and Friday, even if you could push them up, because they said you never know what the availability of hospital beds, emergencies, you never know who might come or not come, and therefore he says that you don't have to push it off, and therefore that seems to be the conclusion that we assume. That I think today the practice is obviously if you can, there's no harm in push. If you can do an elective surgery without any problem, not on a Thursday or Friday, I guess there's no reason to. But if that's the only time, so then there's what to rely on. So the general rule is we don't put ourselves in a situation where it might lead to Gorim, Chilul Shabbos, or other Averis. However, as the Gemara says, with Dvar Mitzvah, one is permitted like the boat ride, and that's what the discussion as well by Bris Milah, a belated bris, or a case of a convert, so the discussion whether the tashbetz of not doing one on Thursday or Friday perhaps, and there may be a distinction, as Rabbi Yaakov Emden makes, between a convert and a Jew who needs a bris milah, and the general Ashkenazic practice seems to be you do it on Thursday and Friday. Well, it's quoted B'Shem Avadia Yosef that he says that the minig Friday is not. And then furthermore, elective surgeries, obviously if you can avoid it, you do, but practically speaking, we don't usually have a say in the matter, and therefore, if it's a more qualified surgeon, or that's the only time you can do it, because you don't know when there'll be another chance. If you don't show up when they tell you, you might have to wait another 6 months. So, by Yikar Adin, it seems to be Yesh Ami Lismoch.